But every good sermon really should be born out of some sort of conviction or struggle that you have. And this is no different than for me. I gave this sermon sort of a fancy title. The title is, Why Are There No Hittites on the Streets of New York? And I wish I could take credit for that title, but I actually got it from another guy who gave a sermon. My sermon's going to be a little different than that, but it's designed to make you kind of think, well, where in the world are you going to go with that? And really, what the sermon was by John Patrick, who I heard give this sermon once, he was talking about the fact that the Hittites, right, were a group of people who were formed about the same time the Israelites were, the Jews were. And his whole point of this is, you know, if I told you I saw some Jews on the streets of New York, you'd say, oh yeah, I can do that. But if I told you I saw some Hittites on the streets of New York, you'd be like, what are you talking about? And so that's the idea, right? That the Hittites, somehow they vanished. They got absorbed into the culture. We don't really know what happened to them. At least I don't know what happened to them. And so the idea was, okay, well, what about us? What about us as Christians? You know, are we going to get absorbed into this culture? And I know that a few of you were on a mission trip we did a couple years ago with Pastor Logan, where we went up and ministered to the first Americans up in Canada. And up there we visited with them, but they happened to have a culture day there. And we went out to the culture day, and they were really trying to get the culture to the next generation. But unfortunately, I see Logan's here. He can testify that there was hardly any of their kids there. We had more kids there than anybody else. And I felt, wow, these people are just one generation from totally disappearing. Their cultures are going to totally disappear. And I'm like, wow, is that going to happen to us? So John Patrick, when he gave this sermon, he was talking about the value, really, of the Jewish dinner table. That's really what he was talking about. He said, you know, one of the things that happened to the nation of Israel, one of the reasons they stuck together, he pointed to like the Sabbath. And I took up here what I'm showing you is a picture of from Fiddler on the Roof, that Sabbath scene where every Saturday night they would gather around, they'd light the Sabbath candle, they'd do the prayers, and the whole family would gather there. And that's very true. I think that's a very practical way in order to keep your family from drifting away, so to speak, and being absorbed into the culture. But here's the question, you know, and this question is, will there be Christians on the streets of New York 1,000 years from now? And part of you are saying, well, geez, of course there will be, right? I mean, this thing that Jesus said in Matthew, right? He said, when Peter confessed that he was the Lord, he said, on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. So, yes, for sure, the church will be here. If the Lord tarries, the church will be here on the streets of New York. So that's not really where I want to go with this. Maybe I'm going to make this a little more selfish in my viewpoint, maybe. But what I want to know is that in 1,000 years from now, will there be members from this church on the streets of Rochester still witnessing to people? Or even more selfish, will there be my descendants still serving the Lord 1,000 years from now? And so I want to kind of talk about that. And to go back and to understand, like, what was the glue that really made the Jewish people survive to the point where we can still see them today? And you think about that, what's the glue that binds? So there's many things that bind people together, but one of the things that you have to kind of come to grips with for that nation, it was really their laws that were given to them by God and their customs. It somehow held them together. And when I was first a Christian, I came to Christ older in my 20s, and I picked up the Old Testament and I tried to read it, and maybe you've had this same experience. You're like, what in the world are all these laws about? Like, there's laws about how you combine threads together, all kinds of laws in there, and you're like, this seems very bizarre to me. And so I had this older, wiser Christian kind of challenge me, well, you should read some things about the customs of the ancient Jewish people. And so we started this. And so recently I did that, and now I have a young guy who came to me and said, I want to learn the Old Testament. So I'm going through these same things with him. And so this is where this sermon came from, because I'm struggling with these things myself. But why do I want to understand God's law? And it depends how you view the Old Testament view of the law. And this is where my view comes from verses like this. And this is out of Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 7 through 11. It said, for the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land with brooks, streams, and deep springs. Be careful that you do not forget the Lord your God, failing to observe his commandments, his laws, and his decrees that I'm giving you today. So there's a couple ways you can look at this. Well, you could say, well, the laws of Israel were sort of just based on their culture, the things that were happening in that time. Or you could look at this as God gave these laws to them for a very specific purpose. And that's the way I view it, that he's trying to teach them something. Now, of course, we know that those laws did not save them. It was just a way for God to demonstrate how maybe a society should work. And if they obeyed those laws, they might be able to see how, learn something about God. And that's how I view these Old Testament laws in my mind, is that maybe I don't have to follow them because, by the keeping of the law, no flesh will be saved. But maybe there's something for me to understand here. And so, as I said, I took this book. It's Roland DeVoe's book long ago, 30 years ago, and I went through all this book, and it teaches you all about the marriage and what they thought about the family, what they think about many different things in the Old Testament. But I find it really interesting what he starts the book out with. So he spent all this time studying this stuff. And the very first chapter is about the wilderness experience. And he makes this statement in the book. And it sort of impacts me in some ways, probably deeper than it did him, because I really believe what I'm studying, even though it's sort of a secular book, there's a lot of truth in this book. And he said, to understand the laws of Israel in the Old Testament, you must understand the wilderness experience. And what I mean by that, the wilderness experience, what I mean is when, they left Egypt, they were in slavery, they went through the Red Sea, and they went out into the wilderness. That's what I mean by that wilderness experience, because he says that once you understand the wilderness experience and what it taught them, then you can understand their laws. I look at that a little different. That's sort of a secular way. I'd say, okay, the wilderness experience was given to them first so that when God gave them the laws, they would understand it. But that's the way the book reads. So he said, this is the major conclusion of the wilderness experience for them. In the wilderness, it said that they learned this fact. It was not even comprehensible to think about in those time periods that an individual could survive unattached to a tribe or a clan. So think about that. If you lived in those times, there was no Supreme Court, there was no police force you could call to come and help you. And so they recognized the fact that to be unattached to a tribe or a clan meant almost certain death for you. Do you remember what Cain said when God said, I'm going to drive you out from my presence? He said, no, I don't want to go out from your presence, because what's going to happen, I'm going to be out there all alone and somebody's going to find me and kill me, right? So if you start thinking about that, then maybe you can start to understand some of these old laws. And so that's how he starts out the whole book, is describing the wilderness event, what all they talked about and what became important for them. And so you end up, if you understand the fact that, wow, you really couldn't survive outside the clan, if you really believed that, then maybe you would write laws like this. So here's one of the laws, right? 6 of the towns you give to the Levites will be cities of refuge, to which a person who has killed someone may flee. And you think, well, that's kind of an odd thing to let someone who killed somebody flee to a different town. But what if you truly were innocent, and now you're in the clan, everybody's fired up, in the clan because someone died in the clan, and you need to go, right? You need to go somewhere. But if you went out into the wilderness, it was almost certain death. Someone was going to find you, enslave you. You would never get a fair hearing on your trial. So you go to another clan, right? And this clan now or another city, and they can then take you in, take care of you, and maybe hear your case, right? And then it also makes you think about things that you find very odd in the Old Testament. And one of those is the story of Lot when he's takes in the strangers that come into Sodom. If you remember that story, these strangers who were really angels came to town because they were going to judge Sodom and Gomorrah. He brings them in, and the men of the town say, bring them out here. We want to have our way with them. And he says, no, brothers, please don't do that. Here, take my own daughters. And you'd be like, wow, that's really crazy. But because of this idea that they had to take in everybody coming into the clan, they made them think in ways that we would never think in our society, right? But in the Old Testament, anybody could join any clan, but they viewed it different according to this book. You could join a clan if you promised a couple of things. First, you agreed to take on the clan's genealogy. So if I was from one clan and I moved to another clan, I would take on their forefathers as my forefathers, their grandfathers as my grandfathers, right? That's foreign to us to think that we would ever do that. But that's what they would do. You would agree that, okay, if I was with Abraham, I would take on Abraham as my descendant, and I would live just as if I was a descendant of Abraham. And then I would agree to marry within the clan. I wouldn't marry outside the clan because keeping the clan together was very important. And then I would also agree to raise my children within the clan. And so I could join a clan and become a member of that clan as long as I promised those things. But I can't help to think that some of this even survives in the church today. The way we view our church today is sort of the same way, right? When I become a member of this church, I agree to take on this church's genealogy, and our genealogy is really traced back to our Father who is Christ, right? I agree to take on the line of Christ. And I view all of you, I should view all of you as my brothers and sisters. Now we say that, but sometimes we don't really, doesn't sink in that we really think that, you guys are all my blood relatives now. Even over my own family, right? Christ said that, that you had to deny even your own family sometimes to come to him. I think this is sort of what you're saying here. He's saying, you gotta see me and my line and my clan as more important than even your own family. And then we agree to marry within the clan. We should agree to marry within the clan. And we raise our children within the clan. And I can't help but think, could you imagine how our fellowship might change if you and I really believed, like in the Old Testament, that there is no way that either of us or me or you could survive outside of this clan? Right? We don't see it that way. I don't see it that way sometimes. I feel like I can go here and be peripherally associated because I don't feel that danger of being wiped out if I go outside the clan. And I can't help but, we love the city of refuge too. We kind of get disgruntled at one clan and we'll go to another clan and we move churches and all that. So you can kind of see those kind of things, the heritage of that, even in our own church. And I find that very interesting. But with that, we all have our own wilderness experience, right? We've done wilderness trips here. I've been on wilderness trips with some of you in here, and they really do define you. The wilderness will bring things out of you that you really haven't seen in you. But here's our new version, American version of wilderness, right? This is a hotel in Chicago who you can have a camping experience. You can go down to Chicago. They'll put you in that nice little tent with a bed and some lights and who knows what else, and they call it glamping, right? I've heard there's even glamping up now in the Boundary Waters. You can have a wilderness experience where you can glamp. And this is how even I want to take on the wilderness, right? Like this is good. I can survive the wilderness as long as I'm glamping, right? That's the way I would view it. But in the wilderness, right, you look at what happened in the wilderness. And so this is a picture of En-Gedi. This is where David spent a lot of time when he was in the wilderness. It's amazing to me how many Christians or so-called influential people in the Bible had wilderness experience. Moses spent time in the wilderness. David spent time in the wilderness. And even Christ sought out a wilderness experience, right? And in this wilderness that you can see, this is the real wilderness, right? It's rocks, it's barren. But yet here there's one stream that's running down through the middle. And that's how the Christian life really is. We live in this land as pilgrims in wilderness, and the only stream that we really have is Christ. He's the only one who really refreshes us. And so we don't really want to have the wilderness experience. Living out there would not be fun. I went out there and spent one day when we toured Israel, went up into that spot. It was so hot, I'm like, can't wait to get back to the air-conditioned bus. That's how we feel about the wilderness experience quite a bit. But there's no denying that the wilderness brings about closeness with God, right? Go and proclaim this in the hearing of Jerusalem. This is what the Lord says. I remember the devotion of your youth, how as a bride you loved me and followed me through the wilderness, through a land not sown, right? Where their original birth of their nation was really spent through that wilderness period. And maybe you kind of remember that when you first got married. Maybe you did some things, lived certain ways that you would never live now. Maybe you had to save money and you lived in campers, or you went different places. And then as you get older, you kind of like, I don't really want to live this way anymore. I want a house. I want to settle down. And really, sometimes when we do that, we can see our zeal from God sometimes drift during those periods. But no doubt, living in the wilderness is hard. You know, when the Israeli people, the Jews came out of Egypt, they went through the Red Sea, great victory. They start wandering through the desert. And one of the places they come to, they call it Rephidim. And they settle down there for a little bit and they rest, right? And so Rephidim, when you see that in the Bible, the word literally means rest. But what happened while they were resting there? Well, they started to grumble. There wasn't enough water, wasn't enough food. What's going on? And so then that's where Moses finally has to strike the rock and the water flows out and they get the water. And he renames the place from Rephidim to Massa, which means testing, and Meribah, which means quarreling. Now you can see that once any church becomes inward focused and we start to rest, what happens? There starts to be quarreling, right? Like, I don't like this and I don't like that, the color of the carpet, and all these things that we talk about, right? I read a book one time called Tally-Ho the Fox, and it was talking about the nature of the church, and that if you take dogs and put them in a cage, they'll step on each other and they'll snap at each other, but you put them out chasing a coon or a fox, they'll run over each other and they're all chasing it and they're all oblivious. I don't know. I grew up doing a lot of coon hunting. And I used to remember those dogs would take on the coon and come back all bloody, all messed up, but seemed to be the happiest they ever were when they came back from chasing those coons, even though they were all bloody and messed up. And that's what happens in the times of resting. In times of resting is where your mind starts to drift. So what happened here? I put this up here. So we're invited to this wilderness experience, and on the other side, you can't see it very well, it says, I just want a comfortable life. What's wrong with that, right? What's wrong with that? That's the American way. That's the American dream. We want a comfortable life. I want to live a certain way, do a certain thing. But I always find it interesting, this verse in Ezekiel, which I have up here, is really the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah. You know, so what was that sin? Well, we know that there were a lot of manifestations of these sins in terms of all the relationships between men and women and all the stuff that was going on there. But I find this verse interesting. It says, now this was the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. They did not help the poor and needy. So they got comfortable with the land. They got comfortable there. And you know how that happens. I mean, it happens to me in my own life. The times when I'm in the biggest danger of sinning is when I sit down and go, I did a lot of work. Now what am I going to do? Maybe I'll go out and browse the internet. Like, ooh, that's a problem, right? And you can see the effects of that on our society. You know, now that we live this life of comfort, we got all these modern convenience, now people are sitting around going, well, who am I really? Am I more like a tree, or am I more like, you know, they start speculating about things that if they were just busy taking care of the people in need and realizing that, you know, there's people around us in need, they wouldn't sit around and think about these things. And I think they'd be better off if they didn't sit around and think about those things. And so this call to the wilderness is our way of God's way of pulling us back in. One thing I didn't finish about Rephidim was when they got to this point, they were grumbling and complaining. You'll see at the end, God sent in an army, the Amalekites, to push them, right? They came in and started a battle against them. And I think it's sort of God's way to push them back out into the wilderness, so they kept on moving forward. I have no doubt that the time we're in now, the COVID and all the pandemic, is one of God's way of pushing us, saying, what is it in life that you really value? Where are you going? Where are you putting your trust? What is really the purpose here, right? And so God is sort of pushing us into this wilderness. None of us like it. I don't like it. You don't like it. None of us like it. But here is where God will draw us close. And I've said this many times. The last time I've been up, I know some of you now better than I would have ever known you if it wouldn't been for the pandemic, because I've been forced to get into some relationships and really serve people. So here's your question. What is your wilderness experience? We all have them. I've heard testimonies. Some of you have gotten to know you have some incredible stories about your wilderness experience. And just like in the coming out of Egypt, that wilderness experience can either push you away, you can harden yourself and rebel, or it can draw you closer to God. That's what the wilderness does. What is our wilderness experience as a church? What will bind us together as a church is how we survive this wilderness experience. We have to think about that. How are we surviving this wilderness experience? And do you feel the draw to go back to Egypt? I do. There's times I'm like, man, I just want to quit. Like, this is too hard. It's easy for me just to go drown myself in my work and go do that. And do I want to rest and just take comfort like I do at Rephidim? And I'm constantly challenging myself to think, man, I need to get back into the game and into the wilderness experience. So this brings me to in this book that I've been reading with another fellow, and we've been going through, he said, well, the nomadic experience became idealized among the Israeli people, that even the prophets talk about, I can't wait to be in my tent, and they're viewing this time when they were out in the wilderness and they were just really close to God and they were dependent on God. And he points these people out called the Rechabites that are in the book of Jeremiah. And so we're going to look at them for the end of the message here. So, but for that, I want to get us all on the same plan about the book of Jeremiah. So what is the book of Jeremiah all about? Well, this book is really about a time where Israel, they got comfortable in the land, they're sinning, they're coming basically in our terms, they're coming to church, pretending to serve God, and then they go out and do everything else the nations are doing. They're serving foreign gods when they're outside the church, and Jeremiah's saying, okay, God's going to deliver you into the hand of the Babylonians because of this. You're not obeying. And they're sitting there saying, well, what do you mean? We're the people of God. We're the Jewish people. We have his laws. We have all these things. That God wouldn't do that to us. He really wouldn't do that to us. And Jeremiah keeps telling them again and again. Well, then we come to chapter 35 in this book, and God gives him basically an object lesson to show the people of Israel. So he gives them this object lesson, and here's the object lesson that he sees. So he said, the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah in the days of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, king of Judah, saying, go to the house of the Rechabites, speak to them, and bring them into the house of the Lord, into one of the chambers, and give them wine to drink. You're like, what is all this about? Where is this going? Well, you'll see where this is going, because the Rechabites have an interesting history. They were part of the nation of Israel, but they kind of saw what was going on, and they decided to live outside the nation, right? And so they come in, and he gives them wine, and they're like looking at this, and this is what they say. But they said, we will drink no wine, for Jonab, the son of Rechab, our father, commanded us, saying, you shall drink no wine, you, your sons, forever. You shall not build a house, sow a seed, plant a vineyard, nor have any of these things, but all your days you shall dwell in tents, that you may live many days in the land where you are sojourners. Thus we have obeyed the voice of Jonadab, the son of Rechab, our father. So they say, no, we're not going to drink the wine you put before us, Jeremiah, because we made this promise. So then Jeremiah turns this into an object lesson for the people of Israel. He says, then came the word of the Lord to Jeremiah, saying, thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, go and tell the men of Judah and all the inhabitants of Jerusalem, will you not receive my instruction to obey my words, says the Lord? The words of Jonab, the son of Rechab, which he commanded his sons not to drink wine, are performed. For to this day they drink none, and they obey their father's commandments. But although I have spoken to you, rising early and speaking, you do not obey me. So what he's saying here, the demonstration is here, look, you got these set of people out there whose earthly father, told them not to do these things, and they obey it. And here I am, your heavenly Father. I'm giving you all these commands, and you're not listening to me, right? And then Jeremiah said to the house of Rechab, thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, because you have obeyed the commandments of Jonadab, your father, and kept all his precepts, and done all according to all the command that he commanded you, therefore thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, Jonadab, the son of Rechab, shall not lack a man to stand before me forever. Right? This is what we want. This is what I want for my family. I want to be said that my descendants who come after me, there will be no one from the line of David Murray, who there's not at least someone standing for the Lord, right? I think all of us deep down want that for our families. And we want that as a church, right? The purpose of this church is to make sure that for generations and generations to come, we see someone standing up for the Lord, right? And that's what we all want. We see this now in the New Testament, right? What we're told about the people of Israel, those who were in the wilderness experience, some of them never made it to the end, which was the promised land. Why didn't they make it? Because they failed to obey God's commands. And he also said they didn't understand the way I work, basically. They don't understand my ways. They don't understand that the wilderness is one of the ways I'm going to draw you closer to myself. They didn't understand that, and they rebelled against that, saying, no, I don't want that. We all know people among us who've fallen away from the faith for very little things. Things like, I just didn't get what, I asked God for one thing and he didn't give it to me, therefore I'm done, right? But no, the ways of God are through the wilderness, and it's although we hate the wilderness and we don't want to be there, it's one of God's ways of keeping us close, humbling us and keeping him close to ourselves. So what am I saying, right? What am I saying here in the end? What am I actually suggesting? Should we live like these people, the Rechabites, go out into the wilderness, isolate ourselves, promise not to do this, that, or the other thing? If that's the way you're viewing this, I think you're not hearing what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say here is that I think there was more to them. I don't think they did this out of the Rechabites didn't do this out of sheer, like, I'm just going to obey, I'm going to work this all up by myself. But they saw the beauty of living apart from this world in terms of shunning everything that the world says is valuable. And I think that's what I'm trying to get us to see. I'm encouraging us to live before other members of this church and for your family in a way that says, I am not interested in the power structure of this world. So how does that work out for me? You know, I work, I do all these things, I publish papers, I do all these things, but I somewhat times to refuse to take credit for some of the things that are going on because this all belongs to God, right? Everything that God helps me with, that's his credit. I'm not interested in promotions, academic titles. I'm not interested in those kind of things, but I'm more interested in serving my fellow man. And that's where you'll find your life. When you lay your life down in that way and you pick it up, you will actually find it, and the wilderness will become precious to you. So I'm going to close with this. This is a very interesting verse. It took me a long time. I used to read this in the book of Proverbs and go, what in the world is Solomon saying this for? So Solomon's going through all the miraculous things of the earth. You know, consider the ant, even though they have no master. You know, they go out and they serve. But in the middle of all this, he says this. He says, the lizard, though you may grasp it with the hand, yet it is in the king's palace. And I kept thinking, why did he put that in there? So one day I was sitting around thinking, man, and I had this vision. I don't know if it's not a real vision, but in my mind's eye, I kind of thought I saw Solomon in his palace, right? And he's walking down the palace, and he's going into the throne room, and some lizard happened to crawl up on the throne. And maybe in his mind he's thinking, man, if that were any man on that throne, I would defend it and kill it. But because it's a little lizard, and I can catch him by the hand, I'm not going to really even worry about that lizard, right? And I think that's a lesson for us as Christians. We're supposed to live in a way that we don't look like a threat to the world. You see things like Compassion International getting kicked out. You see governments oppress the church in China and other places. And it's partly because they see the Christians as a threat to the world. Now, that's not always their fault. Sometimes they're not that way, but that's the way the world sees them. And when the world sees you struggling for the same things they want, then it becomes competition, and they're going to take you on, right? They're going to take you on in competition. But if you don't see it as a threat, I remember specifically one time we were in a store, and Isaiah, my son, he was probably about 2 years old, and there was this big man that was walking through the store, and Isaiah, for some reason, to this day I still don't know why, went up and he punched that man right on his kneecap, basically. And this big honking man looked down at this little boy and he went, ha, 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 and he kept on walking, right? But if I were a big man and I went in and punched him, I don't think he'd keep on walking. I think he would punch me back, right? Because he didn't see him as a threat. So how do we make ourselves not look like a threat to the world? Well, we don't live for the things that the world wants to live for. We don't live for power, money, fame. We live for the glory of God. That will make us look different. And when you truly see that, then people will stop. You know, you look at Paul's life, you know, when he went before the leader of the world, basically, he got an audience because it was obvious to him that he wasn't after the throne of Rome, right? He was just there. He was living in shipwreck. He was living in ways that he couldn't even understand. And I think that's something that we need to challenge ourselves to do this day, is to live in ways that make the world go, what in the world are these people living for? And we no longer look like a threat to the world.